Good evening. Welcome. My name is Jeremy Brown. I teach here at USF in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Tonight we present the second in a three-part series engaging the work of scholars researching the ancient, medieval, and modern history of Jewish-Christian relations. In just a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Natalie Latteri, this evening's featured speaker. But before getting underway, I want to say a few words about the USF Jewish Studies and Social Justice program, which presents this evening's event. Founded in 2008, we are the first and only academic program in the United States formally linking Jewish studies with social justice. In addition to offering numerous courses related to this interdisciplinary field, our program offers a minor degree as well as a number of events that are free and open to the public. These include an annual speaker series on the complexities of Jewish identity, an annual human rights lecture, an annual social justice lecture, and an annual social justice Passover event. Still ahead of us this semester are two special programs that I want to bring to your attention. 1 week from tonight, on Tuesday, April 17th at 6:30 p.m. in this same room, we will hear from our third and final speaker in the present series, celebrated author and religion scholar Ariel Evan Mazie of Stanford University will deliver a lecture on Jewish-Christian relations in the modern period. His talk is titled Beyond the Pale, Visions of Christianity and Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism. Our final event this spring semester will be held Sunday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. at Congregation Emmanuel, where we will celebrate the 40th anniversary of USF's Jewish Studies program. During this event, we will hear from television journalist Jake Tapper, CNN's chief Washington correspondent, on the topic of speaking truth to power. If you're interested in being put on our JSSJ listserv to stay informed about upcoming events, please add your name to the sign-up sheet, which is on the table just outside the entrance to the Berman room. Special thanks for supporting tonight's event goes to our co-sponsors, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, the Joan and Ralph Lane Center for Catholic Studies and Social Thought, the USF Jesuit Foundation, and I also want to acknowledge our community partners at Grace Cathedral, Congregation Beth Shalom, and Lehrhaus Judaica. Now to begin in earnest, I'd like to clarify the main reasons why I've worked to put the series together. At the risk of being somewhat didactic, I want to share with you a list of the 7 main objectives which I've drawn up. First goal of the series is to promote historical understanding about religion from a relational perspective. The series aims to stimulate exchange between researchers, students, faculty, staff, and the community at large in exploring the 2,000-year history of relations between Judaism and Christianity, examining the ways in which the continuous engagement between these two religions has propelled the internal development of each. This is a history characterized by a broad range of relationship dynamics: abhorrence, deceit, and violence, as well as mutual admiration, fascination, and cooperation. Secondly, the series seeks to understand polemical constructions of religious identity. The program is a forum for discussing this relationship from an analytical perspective, which is neither apologetic nor polemical. Our goal is not to defend or justify a history fraught with violence, but rather to impart a better understanding of the profound role that interreligious polemic has played in the complex formation of both Jewish and Christian religious identities through the centuries. Third, we seek to reflect on dangers of polemical rhetoric, especially when directed at vulnerable populations. The present tone of national political rhetoric necessitates widespread reflection on the acute dangers of polemicizing against vulnerable populations. While sociologically speaking, many aspects of the Jewish-Christian relationship are unique, thinking about this particular relationship gives us pause to reflect on the kind of asymmetrical relationships that obtain between communities with disproportionate access to forms of social, legal, and political representation. Fourth, to foster a historically critical sense of community identity. USF has an avowed interest in promoting Catholic identity among its student body, while at the same time seeking to impart the values of social justice. One of the more confusing, sometimes painful, discoveries for undergraduates exploring the history of Jewish-Christian relations is that the exaltation of triumphalist claims of Christian religious supremacy, claims reinforced by overt assertions of Christian political dominance. This kind of exaltation does not sit comfortably with what comes to mind today when we invoke social justice values. To the contrary, historically speaking, such claims of supremacy and dominance have exacerbated a rhetoric of violence against outgroups, a rhetoric which has mandated the subordination and persecution of religious and ethnic populations perceived as out of step with church norms. This series intends to help students account for such discrepancies between past and present, and to prompt critical conversations about such tensions which arise when our institutions promote the pursuit of social justice values on the one hand, without, on the other hand, working vigorously toward a historically critical sense of religious identity. Fifth, bear with me, just a few more. The series seeks to address the relevance of the Jewish-Christian relationship for students of any or no religious background. While offered at a Catholic institution avowing a Jesuit mission, it does not adopt the approach of promoting one particular religious identity above any other. Rather, it aims to provide resources from the history of religions for an audience of any or no religious background, resources for thinking about how communal identities are forged in relationship to the perceived identities of others, and resources for thinking about how intercommunal dynamics impact the way groups define themselves internally. Sixth, the series seeks to make Jewish-Christian relations scholarship accessible to the broader community. The series is intended to improve the strained relationship between religious communities, but not at the cost of obscuring the past. Thus, the series highlights the work of our region's preeminent scholars to prioritize, above all, historical understanding. My interest in prioritizing scholarly accounts is founded on the cautious premise that any community-based efforts at reconciliation that are not based on a rigorous appraisal of the past will not likely achieve more than tentative results. The lecture conversation format of the program intends to make historically critical perspectives on Jewish-Christian relations more accessible to the broader community. And lastly, we seek in the series to stimulate religion scholarship in the public sphere. The series anticipates that increased public awareness of the historical problems of Jewish-Christian relations will have a reciprocally stimulating effect on scholarship itself. And moreover, we aim to encourage and empower scholars to reflect judiciously on the public applications of their research. This evening's program, in particular, deals with a highly controversial topic in the history of medieval Judaism, a topic which can be as provocative to Christians as it can be embarrassing for Jews. But I feel quite confident that tonight's talk, provocative as it may be, is uniquely attuned to the objectives I've just laid out. This is because it drives at the very heart of interreligious polemic. While I'm tempted to say more, I'll try to resist the temptation to be a spoiler. I will only say that we're very fortunate this evening to be joined by Dr. Natalie Latteri, a historian of medieval religion who received her training at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Latteri is an expert in the complex archive of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature composed and or edited in the Middle Ages. In her scholarship, she has explored what these literary traditions have to tell us about medieval religious conceptions of sin, repentance, sexuality, and especially interreligious polemic. Following her lecture, I will join Dr. Latteri in a conversation about the presentation Then we'll conclude with the Q&A session that's open to everyone here. So without further ado, the Ashkenazic Toldot Yeshu, Jewish Stories About Jesus in Medieval Christendom.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It is an honor to be part of this lecture series, and wonderful to see so many of you engaged in the continued discourse and development of Jewish-Christian relations. As Dr. Brown noted, the main topic of my lecture is devoted to Ashkenazic Toldo Yeshu. Ashkenazic, for those of you who don't know, is an adjective referring to Ashkenaz, a Hebrew term for Germany, yes? But more broadly, this term is used to describe Europe at large. If you put it on the present mode. Oh, okay, there we go. Toledot Yeshu refers to a large, highly variegated body of Jewish folklore, which is believed to have been transmitted by word of mouth in and around the Levant since late antiquity. There's some evidence to suggest a Toldot existed in written form as early as the 4th or 5th century, and in Northern Europe since at least the 9th. But Toldot texts do not appear until much later, and the majority date from the 13th century on. The term Toldot is alternately translated as the generations, life story, or biography of, and Yeshu, a term meaning the cursed one. So Yeshu is also a play on the Hebrew pronunciation of Jesus, Yeshua, and refers to the Christian Messiah. All that to say, Ashkenazic Toldo Yeshu are Northern European Jewish stories about the life of Jesus, aka the cursed one. For those of you who are thinking that the designation of Jesus as the cursed one suggests that these Jewish stories were unflattering accounts, you would be correct, mostly. As mentioned above, there is quite a bit of variety among different versions of Toldot, and not all present Jesus as an entirely negative figure. Some actually are fairly sympathetic in their presentation of Jesus' righteousness compared to that of bullying, greedy, or dense Israelite teachers of the law. Nevertheless, all Toldot present Jesus as a curse on the Israelite community, because he so effectively divided it into those who later identified as Christians and those who would come to be recognized as Jews. The fullest surviving text of Toldot Yeshu present Jesus as kind of the bad kid of first century Palestine. He was born out of wedlock, so a bastard, or a mamzer, as Ashkenazic Jews might say. As a child, he was, shall we say, precocious, kind of a smart aleck who refused to show respect to his teachers. Instead, he embarrassed them by posing questions they couldn't answer. For all of you teachers out there, you know how fun these kind of students are in your classroom, right? Great, great fun. Jesus was also cast as an adept, if sometimes mischievous, magician. He could make people believe he was feeding a multitude with a single loaf of bread. Make water taste as if it were wine, heal alleged lepers, raise the dead, even create and animate clay birds that could fly. It's not for nothing that the Toldot did not dispute the Christian belief that Jesus could work wonders. A large part of the impetus behind these stories was explaining how it was that good Israelites, good Jews, might be fooled into converting to Christianity. Claiming Jesus actually could work wonders helped in this regard. The real difference between Christian and Jewish accounts of Jesus' miracles is found in opposing views of where this ability came from, how it was that he could work these wonders. Unlike Christians who believed that Jesus could do anything because he was both the Son of and God incarnate, Toledot accounts indicate that Jesus had learned sleight of hand and the dark magical arts in Egypt from Balaam, the biblical sorcerer credited with encouraging ancient Israelites to engage in orgies with non-Israelites, who in turn convinced Israelites to worship other gods, and so, just cut to the chase, not act as good Jews should. Other versions of Toledot present Jesus as a thief who had stolen the ineffable name of God from the temple, and only through manipulation of it could perform magical feats. It was his wonder-working ability that resulted in a cult following of disciples who believed his lies that he was the Son of God. All this to say that according to Toledot, Jesus was a talented and influential figure. He was a person to be reckoned with. But he was also pretty much the worst Jew to have ever been born. And when he was killed at the hands of Romans, his community could breathe a sigh of relief, collectively. It's spring. In the event that you missed it, Passover and Holy Week were not so very long ago. Traditionally, during Holy Week, Christians reflect on the sacrifice and the events leading up to the death of Jesus. Jews living in Christian lands were also made to reflect on these events, primarily because their Christian neighbors punished them for what many believed was the ultimate sin of killing their Messiah. Since antiquity, through the medieval and early modern eras, and in some instances even during the modern era, Christians have verbally assaulted their contemporary Jewish neighbors with epithets that they are Christ killers. Christians might yell this endearing nickname while stealing or destroying Jewish property and or attacking, wounding, and sometimes killing their Jewish neighbors. I am not, and I'm sure no one here is a fan of such traditions. So this evening, instead of discussing Jesus' demise in Jewish lore, I will break with the liturgical season by focusing on accounts of Jesus' conception and early childhood. As we will discover, there's a whole other set of unfortunate events associated with the young Jesus. So I do kind of feel it necessary to issue kind of a trigger warning. I will be talking a little bit about rape later on, so I am sorry if this is problematic or uncomfortable for anybody in the audience, but it is kind of a necessary component of Toledot Yeshu accounts. Before getting too much into the medieval Jewish stories and suggesting reasons for their idiosyncratic development in Northern Europe, I'd like to discuss earlier stories about Jesus that contributed to them. Some of these might be familiar to many of you. The most famous accounts of Jesus' conception are from the 1st century Gospel of Luke and the 1st or 2nd century Gospel of Matthew. According to Luke, Jesus was conceived when, quote, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary, and he came to her and said, greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you. The angel said to her, you have found favor with God, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High. When Mary questioned how this could happen, not least of all because she was a virgin, Gabriel told her that the Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy. He will be called the Son of God. And Mary consented. Shifting focus somewhat from Mary to Joseph, the Gospel of Matthew relates that, quote, when Jesus' mother had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child. Joseph thought of dismissing Mary quietly until the Lord appeared to him in a dream and told him that the child was conceived by the Holy Spirit. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. These accounts of Jesus' conception, later included in the Christian New Testament, are but two among many stories about Jesus to circulate in the first few centuries of the Common Era. There exist many non-canonical, also known as apocryphal accounts, but these are still very much Christian stories about Jesus that would develop in the early centuries of the Common Era. These would continue to be transmitted long after, and in some cases even into the modern era. Popular stories about Jesus were told right alongside and sometimes instead of the official gospel accounts. They informed the beliefs of the common people, the laity, and oftentimes either reinforced or contributed to church teachings and doctrine. For example, the 2nd century infancy gospel of James, like the gospel of Luke, noted Mary's virginity at the time of Jesus' conception. Like the gospel of Matthew, it also stressed that Mary and Joseph never engaged in sexual relations. In the gospel of James, Joseph was already, quote, an old man when he was charged with caring for her, and presumably past the point of sexual interest. Beyond this detail, James also includes a priestly trial by ordeal to prove their chastity. What does that mean? So the priest required both Joseph and Mary to drink foul, brackish water that may have even been poisoned. The idea was if they didn't fall down dead or become rather ill, they were innocent of all culpability. They had not had illicit sexual relations together. So neither Mary nor Joseph got sick after drinking the water, so the priest declared them to be innocent. The idea that Mary remained a virgin perpetually became widely supported by Christian exegetes in the 4th century and would later become the official church position. In addition to the priestly trial of Mary and Joseph as ever virgin, Mary was further suggested in the Gospel of James through another scenario that is lacking in the canonical Gospels. Okay, so the idea that she was a perpetual virgin is also suggested in James through another scenario. According to James, a midwife, Salome, had been present at the birth of Jesus, but Salome did not initially believe Mary's virginal status. To lay rest to her suspicion, the midwife checked the new mother shortly after she'd given birth and discovered that Mary was a virgin not only when she conceived Jesus, but throughout the duration of her pregnancy, and even after giving birth, her hymen remained fully intact. This is important. So Salome's presence at Jesus' birth, her testing of Mary, and the discovery of her perpetual virginity would become a common scene in medieval and Renaissance art. Uh-oh. Here we go. Here we have a depiction of Salome as a midwife to Mary that's found in an 11th century Byzantine church in Cyprus. Again, the midwife Salome is not found in the canonical Gospels. She is a later addition to the Apocrypha. So she is over here on the side. And here in an early 15th century Netherlandish altar panel painting, we have a depiction of Salome not only as a midwife to Mary, but also maimed. So I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but her hand is withered as punishment from God because she even questioned Mary's virginal status. Here in a deluxe French manuscript from the 15th century Latin Book of Hours, we find Salome attending to Mary, and here her hands are completely severed from her body as punishment for her disbelief. I should point out that even though Salome was said to have been maimed for her disbelief, God had mercy on her and restored her once she begged forgiveness, paid due deference, and reached out her hands to touch the holy baby Jesus. Thus, we have in this story an interesting dichotomy that we see time and time again in the history of Jewish-Christian relations throughout the Middle Ages. Namely, there's a tentative license for violence against non-believers, non-Christians that is, as well as an example of magnanimous forgiveness for former disbelief in the form of full restoration, and the idea that converts were welcome into the fold of the church, again, once they converted. Another popular non-canonical Christian account of Jesus' early life is found in the 2nd century Gospel of Thomas. While there are a number of versions of Thomas's gospel, most provide an account of Jesus' early childhood that is largely absent from the biblical accounts. Those of you who are familiar with the Gospels might recall that beyond the Annunciation, Matthew includes the adoration of the Magi and the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt to escape Herod's persecution. Luke includes some other stories. He includes the Nativity, Jesus' presentation and circumcision at the temple, and an older 12-year-old Jesus teaching the law at the temple. These scenes bookend the Gospel of Thomas, which is dominated by a number of miracle episodes from Jesus' early childhood. So the majority of these start when the Holy Family is returning to Nazareth, and they go up to the point where he is said to have preached at the temple. Among the episodes found in the Gospel of Thomas are some of which are similar to those found in the much later Toldo that would circulate in medieval Europe. For instance, versions of both the Christian Apocryphal Gospel and the Toldo include a miracle of Jesus animating clay birds and making them fly, and both include a very similar story that Jesus was a gifted, albeit smart aleck student. Toldo present Jesus as disrespectful pupil who refuses to bow or lower his eyes upon meeting the teachers, in addition to asking these difficult questions. Interestingly enough, the Gospel of Thomas has a far more disrespectful student, which one would think would be a negative attribute, but perhaps not to a community who did not respect rabbinic teaching. In Thomas's account, Jesus cursed his teacher and struck him dead when he grew aggravated at the boy's arrogance and slapped his head. So the teacher hits Jesus upside the head, Jesus says, "Die," and he dies. As in the Gospel of James, this story has a happy ending. Jesus miraculously raised the deceased teacher from the dead once another teacher paid the boy due deference. Also, like the Gospel of James, the Gospel of Thomas would provide ample material for medieval and Renaissance scribes and artists to represent and modify according to the particular needs of their community. So here we see a very public, evidently ecclesiastical sanctioned representation of the apocryphal story of Jesus animating the clay birds. Here is an image of Jesus and the birds in a 14th century German vernacular manuscript. This particular manuscript has the apocryphal along with the gospel accounts side by side. So the idea is that they are completing rather than competing with one another. The same manuscript also includes the teacher's rebuke of Jesus. So here you see the teacher getting ready to slap Jesus upside the head, but not quite there yet. However, this manuscript does not have an image of Jesus killing the teacher. Okay, Northern European Christians added to the episodes in the popular infancy Gospel of James and Thomas during the Middle Ages, sometimes in ways that reinforce the acceptability of Christian violence towards non-believers more than this manuscript does. So, for example, this 14th century Anglo-Norman deluxe manuscript, we have a young Jesus and his playmate. The boys are playing. One of the other boys is beating Jesus at a game, so he's winning the game, and Jesus is aggravated and kills him. Very, very nice Messiah there. Let's see. The same manuscript includes a story that the parents of Nazareth refused to permit their children to play with Jesus. They recognized Jesus was the bad kid, and they said, "No, you're not hanging out with that mamzer." And so they, interestingly enough, had the bright idea to hide their children in an oven for safekeeping. Upon discovering this, Jesus transformed the children into the most anti-Jewish, some might say Christian, of beast, pigs. Here we have the children turned into pigs, so that not even their parents could associate with them according to Jewish law. It is often assumed that the apocryphal Gospels function to sate popular desire among early and medieval Christians to know more about their Savior than what they might learn in the biblical Gospels of Luke and Matthew. While I don't deny this aspect of the Apocrypha, these examples also reflect Christian responses to theological controversies present since early Christianity and sustained throughout the Middle Ages, as well as strained interfaith relations. By telling of a Savior who was willing to smite a teacher who failed to recognize his authority, or to maim a midwife for disbelief of his mother's purity, the main point of these episodes appears to have been to emphasize the doctrines of the virgin birth and the incarnation of Jesus. They do this by reinforcing Jesus' divine ability to not only punish, but also to heal completely. as well as his miraculous holy conception in an unquestionably pure, intact vessel, the womb of a virgin, to an audience who may have been hesitant to believe, either because of their own suspicions or because of the widespread criticism of fundamental Christian tenets. By casting Jesus as a hothead who engaged in violence towards non-believers, they also seem to condone similar acts of violence carried out by Christian followers of Jesus against their neighboring non-believers, of which there were many. Of the different groups who criticized or had questions about Christian teachings that would eventually be recognized as church doctrine, our primary concern is those raised by Jews that would find their way into medieval Ashkenazic Toldo. Bearing this in mind, it was not uncommon for Jewish critiques to be combined with the critiques of pagans, heterodox Christians, and later Muslims. So they're all sharing some of kind of the fundamental criticisms of Christianity, specifically in regard to the virgin birth and incarnation. Among the earliest accounts of Jewish criticism of the Christian doctrines of the virgin birth and incarnation come to us from the 2nd century pagan philosopher Celsus's anti-Christian polemical treatise, Word of Truth. It should be noted that Celsus's text has only survived in quotation by the church father Jerome, so what we have is actually a third-hand account of what the Jewish critiques were. In Word of Truth, Celsus crafted a scenario of a Jew who was all too willing to relate his community's belief that Jesus was the product of an adulterous liaison between Mary and a certain Roman soldier identified only as Pandera. The name of the soldier, Pandera, was very common in the Latin literature of the era, and here might be regarded as the antique equivalent of a John Doe. When Mary's husband discovered her affair with this Pandera fellow, he drove her away, and as a result, she led a life of poverty as a spinner of cloth. And as she worked, Mary is said to have left her hair uncovered in the public market, thus suggesting she may have been plying a bit more than her handiwork there. Put more bluntly, that she was inviting the solicitation of men. She was kind of a prostitute in the market. In another second-hand account composed around 200, the Christian author Tertullian provided a brief comment on Jewish belief in regard to Mary that complements Celsus's allusion to her profession. Here, Jesus was referred to plainly as a prostitute's son. Celsus and Tertullian's specific ideas about Mary as a woman who had engaged in an adulterous affair with a foreign lover and or had acted as a common whore were reiterated in fleeting snippets in the Babylonian Talmud. Here, Mary is said casually and without too much elaboration or dispute on the matter to have had a husband as well as a Roman lover named Pandera, who sired her child. So the second and third-hand hearsay from the first couple of centuries regarding Jewish slander of the virgin birth and incarnation weren't necessarily false. The Jewish sources are confirming these earlier rumors. To the contrary, elements of these early Jewish versions of Jesus' conception would find their way into Ashkenazic Toldo, where they began to take on context-specific characteristics. The earliest indication of an Ashkenazic Toldo tradition also reaches us through hearsay, beginning in the 9th century, shortly after Jews were invited en masse to Charlemagne's territory, and were favored by the Carolingian monarchs for their linguistic abilities, culture, and wealth it was rightly assumed that they would bring to the Frankish realm. When these new groups of Jews and Christians confronted each other, members of the upper echelons of society and many religious scholars interacted amicably. But some Christians were jealous of the political, economic, and social favors shown to Jews, who they held responsible for Jesus' death. Less talked about, some Jews were also leery of assimilating into the broader Christian culture, because in efforts to maintain amicable relationships with their host, and because of pragmatic concerns for Jewish livelihood, some rabbis had become lenient. So some would say overly lenient in their interpretation of Jewish law and how they could interact in ways that would still maintain Jewish purity within this Christian context. It's in the context of renewed efforts to maintain religio-ethnic distinction, identifying what separated Jews from Christians in an atmosphere where the lines had become a bit blurry, that we see a resurgence in doctrinal disputes. In the Frankish realm at the time, these disputes, as in the past, centered on the nativity and the incarnation of Jesus. So after what appears to have been centuries of limited Jewish interest in critiquing Jesus' conception, this familiar theme starts to crop up. In the mid-9th century, Amelot, a Carolingian archbishop of Lyon, who was not very pleased with what he perceived as deferential treatment of Jews in the realm, complained of the alleged beliefs of his Jewish neighbors and efforts to encourage stricter laws regulating their behavior. He wrote that his Jewish neighbors had a vile book about Jesus and the Holy Family, and that as an accompaniment to their prayers, quote, they, so this is the Jews, they say that they believe him, Jesus, to be the impious son of an impious man, that is, of I know not which heathen, whom they call Pandera, by whom they say the mother of the Lord was defiled, and thus conceived Jesus. So, to be clear, according to Amelot, Ashkenazic Jews said their prayers and then recited that Mary was defiled. This is a euphemism for rape. So Mary is defiled by some impious man of whatever origin, we don't know, but his name is Pandera. More on the particulars of Amelot's account in a moment. First, I'd like to point out that beyond the Archbishop's mention of this version of Jesus' conception and life, his second-hand account, the existence of some form of Ashkenazic Toldo is verified by Jewish sources, albeit somewhat later. In the 12th century, Rabbi Fromm of Bonn mentioned a text entitled Toledot de Yeshu. This does not mean that a Jewish text of Toldo did not exist until the 12th century, but maybe that Jews didn't want to advertise it when they're living in Christian territories. It would not be smart to do so. It should also be noted that a rose by any other name remains a rose. So even without explicit title attached, Jewish anti-Christian polemics similar to that expressed by Celsus, Tertullian, and that found in the Babylonian Talmud, which would be incorporated into many versions of Toldo, are found in the multiple epithets for Jesus that would become exceedingly common in Northern European Jewish texts. These include insults that Jesus was the son of the whore, alternately a bastard son of a menstruating woman, or the combined bastard son of a menstruant and whore, for the double effect. Amelot's claim that his neighboring Jews recited anti-Christian slander as part of their prayers may also have some merit. In the 13th century Ashkenazic liturgy for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Israel was directed to sing to the Lord in affirmation of their covenant with God, while denouncing Mary as a promiscuous woman and Jesus as a bastard in the closing prayer. Quote, the nations call your holiness, a reference to Israel, to a son of whoredom. Your chosen ones despise the one conceived of the whore. So it's an identification of both Jesus and Mary, and a self-identification that Jews will not believe in the whore or her son. The blending of a Jewish declaration of faith and penance found in this prayer is further suggested in Ashkenazic inquisitorial records. These show that by the mid-14th century at least, apostates who wished to revert to Judaism and to incite Christians to kill them so that they might die as holy martyrs recited formulaic renunciations of Jesus as an accursed bastard and Mary as the greatest of whores. So, as in the case with some of the earlier hearsay about Jewish beliefs, we can confirm parts of Amelot's account of his Jewish neighbors. We know that there was a Toledot tradition in Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages that includes information about Jesus' conception, and that some of the slanderous language associated with it was recited by Jews as part of their religious ceremonies. We also know that all of the extant Toldot, the earliest of these, that include a conception story, originate in Northern Europe. But what are the details that Amalo mentioned that differ from Celsus, Tertullian, and the Babylonian Talmud? In these earlier accounts, and in many of the medieval epithets used to describe her, Mary was depicted as a promiscuous woman who consented to an illicit affair with a Roman soldier and conceived Jesus. In Amalo's version, by contrast, Mary was defiled by an impious man of uncertain religio-ethnic origin. Unfortunately, we do not have an extant Ashkenazic recension of Toledot, something beyond hearsay, that mentions Jesus' conception until the 15th century. The manuscripts of it and related versions date primarily from the 17th through 19th centuries. Bearing this caveat in mind, each of the Ashkenazic accounts that we do have include the idea that Mary was a non-consensual party in Jesus' conception, as had Amalo. But the later Toldo also includes some notable variations and additions to Amalo's account. In them, Amalo's impious man of unknown religio-ethnic origin is identified specifically as a wicked Jew. And not only did he rape Mary, he raped her while she was menstruating. These details reflect the development of Jewish critiques of the virgin birth and incarnation in medieval Ashkenaz, as well as mounting self-criticism regarding overfamiliarity with Christians and assimilation to Christian society. They also provide a revenge fantasy condoning violence in a manner that is not so dissimilar from that found in contemporary Christian Apocrypha. In the earliest Ashkenazic Toldo version of Jesus' conception, the reader is presented with a fuller narrative of Mary, and she plays a far more substantive role than in Amalo's account. The tale begins with a depiction of Jesus' conception. Mary was a descendant of Israel and her fiancé Yochanan of the royal Davidic lineage. Yochanan was a good Jew, both God-fearing and well-versed in Scripture. And one Sabbath Eve, while he was away, presumably at temple, a, quote, good-looking neighbor, Yosef ben Pandera, passed by Mary's house. In a drunken state, this good-looking Yosef went inside and began to behave as if he were her fiancé. Mary, quote, thought in her heart that he was her fiancé Yochanan, but even so, when he began hugging and kissing her, she hid her face in shame and protested, saying, "Do not touch me, for I am menstruating." Yosef, quote, was not alarmed and did not pay attention to her words. He lay with her, and she conceived from him. When Yochanan returned in the middle of the night and sought to have relations with Mary, presumably once Pandera had fled the scene, she asked him about his uncustomary behavior of seeking her twice in one night and engaging in sexual activity while she was menstruating. In frustration, Yochanan left and told his rabbi what had happened. Shortly after discovering Mary's pregnancy and suspecting Pandera to be the father, Mary's fiancé Yochanan fled to Babylonia in shame. He left Mary alone to bear and raise Jesus, seemingly without manners. This is shown in his refusal to bow to his teachers again and asking the gotcha questions. For these offenses, one of the rabbis declared he was a bastard, and another that he was the bastard and the son of a menstruating woman. These two epithets referencing Jesus' illegitimacy and inherently defiled status as an explanation for his wickedness. So, because he was conceived this way, this helps to explain kind of why he's such a bastard, right? Why he's such a mamzer. Shortly thereafter, the rabbis paid Mary a visit and questioned her about Jesus' parentage. Upon examination, they determined that Mary was not liable for conceiving Jesus because Pandera's bad reputation preceded him, and surely he was the culprit. In this account, the idea that Mary was a non-consensual victim of sexual assault is clear, and her assailant's identity as a Jew is belied by the addition of a Hebrew name and patronymic, so Yosef ben. But in addition to these elements that appear to have been built upon the 9th century Toledot that Amalo complained of, Mary rejected Yosef ben Pandera with verbal protests that referred to Jewish purity laws against copulating with a woman during her menses. The Babylonian Talmud and response literature indicates that women often claim to be menstruating when they were not, to avoid unwanted sexual advances. It was commonly believed that even a wicked man would refrain from raping a woman if he thought she was menstruating, because she was likened to impure meat, and the penalty for copulating with her was death by divine mandate. In medieval Europe, these laws became popular among the Reform sect known as the Hasidei Ashkenaz, or Pious of Ashkenaz, who promoted the belief that a child conceived of a menstruant would be unable to learn Torah properly, or ever be counted among the pious, but would be an idol worshiper whose moral nature was inherently flawed. At the same time, Christians in medieval Europe were busy debating whether or not Mary menstruated at all. In large part because Jews had doubled down on their criticism of the incarnation and claimed that God would never inhabit the filthy womb of a woman. In response, Christian ecclesiastics came to the conclusion that Mary did not, in fact, menstruate. So the addition that she did in Ashkenazic Toldo serves multiple polemical functions simultaneously. In subsequent Ashkenazic Toldo, the Jewish Pandera and the rape of a menstruating Mary would become more pronounced. In one version, the narrator indicates that Mary, quote, screamed and cried out in a bitter voice and said, "What are you doing now? I have just begun menstruating." And in the most popular version to circulate in Northern Europe, Yosef was not only Jewish, but also, quote, a pimp, an evil man, and a scoundrel. But this version also includes other telling details that deserve consideration. In it, Yosef befriended Mary's fiancé, Yochanan, for the purposes of having his way with her. Mary warned her fiancé to avoid Pandera because she recognized him to be an evil man. But Yochanan protested, claiming that his own goodness might rub off and positively influence the scoundrel. Yochanan was wrong. Pandera got him so drunk that he passed out, and as Yochanan slept, Pandera stole into Mary's house and pretended to be her exceedingly devout fiancé. He tricked her by turning out all the lights and reciting the Shema with vigor. Even so, Mary rejected his advances because she was menstruating. To remedy the situation, Pandera lied and told her that a new halacha had recently been taught, that a man may copulate with his menstruating fiancé. Mary believed him, and he had his way with her, once that night, and then once again in the morning, and thus conceived Jesus. In each of these Ashkenazic Toldo, Mary did most definitely conceive a bastard while she was menstruating. These two corrosive details were enough to mar Jesus in utero and would eventually lead to his disastrous severing of the Jewish community and the spawning of a new class of persecutors, Christians, whom Ashkenazic Jews lived among. In most cases, however, Mary is not presented so much as an adulterous or promiscuous woman, but as a naive victim who believed that her protest against sexual transgression might save her from defilement by any Jewish man who should have also been aware of the consequences of copulating with a woman during her menses. Or as one who mistakenly believed that she could put her trust in a man known to be learned and pious, but who she only later discovered who had lied about his identity and halakha to serve his own purposes. In these situations, Mary's victimization is not entirely dissimilar from that of medieval Ashkenazic Jews, who as early as the Carolingian era protested what they had perceived as lenient interpretations of halakha by the rabbis, regarding anything from the handling of ritually impure meat, or trading in the trappings of Christian religious ceremony, or creating their synagogues to look like Christian churches, to fraternizing with apostates and Christians for economically advantageous purposes. So especially devout members of the Ashkenazic community claimed that this leniency resulted in collective defilement of the community that had incited God's wrath and so justified persecution against them. So they were blaming themselves for all of the persecutions that would befall them. When allusions to Mary's promiscuity are mentioned in the Ashkenazic Toldo, they are typically faint, but statements of Yosef's good looks and mention of repeated sexual coupling, once even in the light of day, when confusion about who he was seems much less likely, suggest that Mary may not have been completely, or that she may not have completely balked at all of this impious Yosef's advances. In these cases, perhaps Mary was like the majority of Ashkenazic Jews, who only initially, if ever, resisted halakhic leniency. Like her, they could appreciate some of the attractive benefits of not looking too closely into the legality of matters, however fleeting and ultimately disastrous it would be to do so. Medieval Ashkenazim would also have identified with Mary's defilement in relation to the many medieval pogroms, where Jews were forcibly converted. In rabbinic literature, forced converts are referred to as anusim. This term is also applied to the victims of rape, including Mary in the Ashkenazic Toldo. This connection between physical and spiritual defilement was concretized when Northern European Christians took Jewish women hostage in pogroms. Such occurrences became increasingly common after the 1096 Crusade pogroms, and when these pogroms did occur, it was not uncommon for the Jewish community to suppose that the woman had both been raped and forcibly converted. So the term was a catch-all for both forms of defilement at once. Having been thus doubly defiled, the women were perceptually transformed into different entities altogether, either non-Jews or harlots. In seizing Jewish women, the Christian aggressors also emasculated the community's male population through the defilement of their mothers, sisters, wives, daughters, and affirmed the subservience of the entire group under Christian rule. However much the Ashkenazim might have been able to identify with the Mary of the Toledot, who had been lied to and assaulted, she, so much more than medieval Jewish women who had been compromised through rape or forced conversion, could not be counted as part of the Jewish community. For it was through the fruit of her womb that Israel had been severed in two, the Jewish community and the Christian community. And another reason that Jews continued to suffer persecution in Northern Europe was owing to the belief in Jesus as the awaited Jewish Messiah, that only Christians had been smart or faithful enough to recognize. To prove that they could resist the temptation to become like and part of the dominant Christian culture Mary represented, the Jewish authors and propagators of Toledot maligned her as a menstruant and or whore, as a denial of her inviolate purity, which Christians touted as a characteristic of her saintly status. They also defiled her literary persona in a matter directly responding to Christian treatment of Jewish hostages and forced converts. And in this way, the rape of Mary in Toledot may have functioned as an expression of revenge fantasy to dominate Christians in the way that Christians had dominated them. I would like to conclude with an often repeated truism. Man is a complex animal. Women, too, interestingly enough, are complex. Ashkenazic Toldo Yeshu, as well as Christian stories about Jesus, reflect some of humanity's complexity. These stories grapple with such themes as group identity and inferiority complex, religious intolerance and persecution, rape culture, and much more. It is my hope that discussions around these themes and how they impacted and continue to impact Jewish-Christian relations, as well as our broader culture, will lead to introspection and understanding of each other's hurt, and that understanding might lead to healing. Thank you for entertaining my hope this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I don't want to take too much time because I'm sure that many of you have questions for Dr. Latteri, but I do want to ask a few questions. In your talk, you distinguished between these apocryphal details about Jesus' biography from medieval Christian art on the one hand, and on the other hand, these other apocryphal details about Jesus' biography from Toledot Yeshu, some of which coincide.
Yeah.
How do you account for the coincidence on the one hand, but also the very different usage of the art and the lore in Christian and Jewish context?
I think that the coincidence is just basically a reflection that these groups remain in constant contact and dialogue. So even in the early centuries of Christianity, you have Christian church fathers going to see, scholars of Hebrew to find translation. So they're talking to each other, they're trading with each other. Some of them are even singing psalms together. They're exchanging in all kinds of relationships together. So I think it's preposterous to assume that they also wouldn't pick up on some of each other's folklore, right? Big surprise, Jesus was a Jew. So the Jewish community around him was familiar with some of the acts and miracles associated with him, even in later times. The early gospel writers were Jews. So there was a lot of exchange back and forth. The different uses do primarily come from wanting to maintain distinct identities. So if you have a similar story, you can spin it in such a way that it is a positive story on the one hand. So for Christians, it's a positive thing that Jesus can animate these clay birds. This shows his divine nature. Whereas for the Jewish accounts, this shows he's mischievous and a magician. So I don't know if that answers the question.
And would you, from a historical perspective, guess or hypothesize if there's any continuity between the medieval Christian artistic representations of these biographical details and these ancient gospels, some of which were not known until recent archaeological discovery?
So, yes, I do think that there are some similarities, especially beginning around the 11th century, when we see a lot more transmissions of text. So even though they were newly discovered, so a lot of the Apocryphal Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, this is a different Gospel of Thomas, though.
Okay.
So yeah, the infancy gospel is different than the Natalie.
Thank you.
Yeah. So these are two distinct gospels. But so, yeah, these gospels, the infancy gospels, were well known, as attested to even by the manuscripts that have these apocryphal gospels along with the canonical gospels. So these start to get transmitted into Northern Europe around the 11th century.
A very specific question. You referred to liturgical uses of curses in different forms, both as preserved in Christian accounts and in medieval Ashkenazic liturgy. You referred specifically to a Yom Kippur prayer. What's the source of that?
So it is the old version of the Elenu, and I do have it in my notes if you would like that later. So yeah, that is the translation of the old Ashkenazic liturgy, but I definitely have that source for you in my notes.
So it seems to me from your presentation that there are, you suggested many different avenues to account for the historical endurance of this lore. It serves a number of different functions, perhaps different functions in different historical contexts over time. But one that I'm particularly struck by is the way in which cursing Jesus and Mary can function to solidify one's identity as not Christian, particularly when returning from nominal conversion to Christianity. Would you be willing to hypothesize that particular function of the Toledot Yeshu is stronger than some of the other ones that you suggest?
That the cursing function is stronger than, say, the rape narrative, or what?
Well, that the way in which cursing Jesus and Mary helps to consolidate Jewish identity as distinguished from another group in which the Jews remain in intimate contact.
Definitely, yes. So, as you know, I talked with you a little bit. My dissertation is on the Hebrew chronicles of the First Crusade, and these are chock full of epithets cursing Jesus and Mary, specifically after Jews are put in or put themselves in situations that may be extremely questionable such as in the chambers of bishops. Does this actually refer to Jews converting? Because it's only after they're found to go into these very Christian spaces that you have lots of curses. So I do think that cursing functions in a way to not only solidify identity, but also to return to a Jewish identity. To say, yes, I was tempted for a while by this Christian community for various and sundry reasons, perhaps because you didn't want to be murdered, right? Doesn't have to be for economic gains. But the way that you can fully return is by denouncing the group that you fleetingly, momentarily had joined for whatever reason.
And one last question, this is a very general one. How do, when you're teaching students about the Toledot Yeshu lore, how do you get past the sort of initial stock responses of either provocation on the one hand or just sort of, oh, how naughty, I mean, what uses is teaching Toledot Yeshu? Why would you put assign Toledot Yeshu on a syllabus in the course on Jewish-Christian relations, for example?
So one of the reasons that I think Toledot Yeshu are important, and one of the reasons that I value them, is because I like the idea of persecuted minorities standing up and showing a little bit of chutzpah, maybe not in the greatest of ways, but they are not these passive victims going into their good night. They're not going to go out without a fight. Whether or not that's slanderous, okay. So to me, it shows some gumption, shows some moxie, even if it's not condoned to do such. Far more importantly, I think that it shows how these two groups are acting in very similar ways. So if you can understand that Christians aren't the only ones talking bad about Jews. Christians are not the only ones who are saying that Jews are bestial, or that Jewish men menstruate, or that they don't have, higher levels of cognition. Jews are saying the same thing about Christians. So it says something about this shared milieu, this shared community, where everybody can insult each other. Whether or not that's beneficial, it's generally not. But the idea is that they are still engaging with each other. And at the same time, as you have these fierce polemics, you still have Jews and Christians engaging in business. So it's one more layer of Jewish-Christian interaction. It's one more way to say that Jews were not this isolated enclave within, broader Europe. They were very much part of the societies and the communities within which they lived.
So now I'd like to open the floor for questions for Dr. Latteri.
What apocryphal books did those pictures come from?
So those were from the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of James, and then the last one is an infancy gospel entitled The Deeds of Our Savior.
Which of those were of the Gnostics, the Gnostic apocryphals?
So that would be Thomas and James. The other one that I mentioned doesn't even begin to be circulated until the 13th century, and it is exclusively a Northern European genre.
And is it correct that those two Gnostic apocryphas were written after the ascension of Jesus?
Yeah. So all of the Gospels were supposedly written after the ascension of Jesus. So Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of James are 2nd century texts, or this is what they're usually said. So I believe that the Gospel of James is mentioned as early as 150, and the Gospel of Thomas is definitely mentioned before 200. So they're 2nd century accounts.
So I have to agree with you that the knowledge of Christianity that's embedded in this text does represent the kind of interplay, interaction between Christians, Jews and Christians, and the specific kind of Christian knowledge that Jews are able to possess. but it's also a liability. They're certainly not writing these texts in the hope that Christians will read them. It's a danger. These are dangerous documents to possess. So what function does it serve? There are so many manuscripts for these, especially as we get later in the Middle Ages. What function does it serve kind of in a community setting?
So, interestingly enough, the first Ashkenazic manuscript that we have that includes the conception story was written with the help of a Jew who had converted to Christianity. So in one sense, it functions very much for these Jews to claim their new identity. So they can now become part of the in-group by telling all the secrets of the out-group, right? So the same thing is what happens when we hear about all of these epithets in the Talmud trial. So that's one part of the equation here, is that former Jews are ratting out their former co-religionists, right? The other way that the texts function internally within the community, I have some hypotheses about this. I think that these texts, along with a good majority of other texts that maybe have not been interpreted as such, are to function to kind of shed light on these ambiguities of the idea that Jews could somehow identify with this figure of Mary. So even though these have really blasphemous things about Christians, they're also kind of Jewish penitentials. Like, what has happened? A Jew in Israel did this. This doesn't say something good about the Jewish community if a Jewish man raped a woman. This says something that the community needs to step up its game, because what have we done to produce this kind of thing? Again, that's not usually how the Toledot are read. This is my kind of idea. Other than that, everybody needs a little comic relief. Sometimes it is fun to poke fun at or malign the other group. We see that in contemporary politics all the time. You know, you say that a certain political party, they're from backwoods Arkansas, whatever the case is. It's the same kind of thing that's going on in Toldo. Everybody is collectively talking crap on each other. So I think that it is a way to blow off steam. But there are several uses of it. I don't have a specific, just one answer for you.
So are there any significant, like, conversions from, like, people converting to Judaism in Europe?
Yes, most definitely.
And in what time periods would that have been?
So one of the most famous early converts...
And where, sorry.
Oh, okay. So my main focus is for Ashkenaz in here. So we do see lots of converts to Judaism in Ashkenaz. One among the earliest is somebody who was in the Carolingian church. His name is Bodo. He converted. He became Eliezer. He was upset at how corrupt he believed that the church had become. And this was a sticking point because he was a contemporary of Amilo. So this is part of the reason that Amilo and his cohort are getting so mad. So we start to see this wave of conversion, not wave, it's more of like a trickle of conversions to Christianity. As soon as Jews move en masse into the Carolingian realm, you have some Christians who start to think that the Jewish tradition is better than the Christian tradition, and so they do convert. So it is especially problematic when higher members of the church do, such as Bodo turned Eliezer. But it's also problematic because whenever we start to see heretical accounts that pop up, they're often linked with Judaizing components. So the same time that we have these Jewish critiques of the Nativity and Incarnation, all of the ecclesiastics are talking about those pagans and those heterodox Christians who are saying really similar things. And by the way, they're talking to the Jews. So it's the idea that lots of people are in contact with Jews in Northern Europe. We do have some cases of prominent conversion, but on the lower parts of society, whenever there's usually kind of an outcry of heretics, they are in some way associated with Judaizing from the 9th century throughout the remainder of the Middle Ages.
Was going farther away from conception, when he was seen as a magician, is that kind of, since the northern concepts at this time were getting into numerology and permutating the letters, all of a sudden he makes turns a complete figure into a human. He's not idolater, he's more just a magician. He's taken the, if that's what they said he was doing, he was taking the letters of creation, turning that into.
Yeah, so this idea that Jesus was able to animate the clay birds, and the idea that he stole the ineffable name, and the idea that he learned magic from Egypt. So the idea that he learned magic from Egypt and the idea that he stole the ineffable name usually occur in two different categories of Toldo, right? Because there's a broad variety. Both of these stories, though, predate Hasidism in Northern Europe. So that is a really interesting correlation, though. But yeah, he was given these attributes long before, in the earliest versions that we have. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about it this time. But yeah, that did exist prior to that.
Back to forced conversions. If we're going back to the south, in the 15th century, conversions, something we celebrated mystics.
Oh yeah, St. John of the Cross, yeah.
Teresa.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is why I have oftentimes in the mystical literature, so for St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul. You're grappling with lots of things. It's not just necessarily your relationship with God, but how your relationship with God functions in the variety of different kind of communities that you must, by chance, also be part of. So there are a lot of different layers to that. But the conversos and the converts in Northern Europe do play a major role in the Toledot kind of story, especially in terms of cursing Christians.
You mentioned some Jews trying to become martyrs by repeating formulaic slanders. Can you expand on the context there?
Yeah, so in inquisitorial records, the inquisitorial records are Christian accounts that Jews say this with the idea that they will be killed because of it. So there's a tradition starting much earlier. Let me see, the Martyrs of Cordoba. I'm trying to think what century that was. So this is...
Nine.
Okay, thank you. So the Martyrs of Cordoba also had this idea, this is Christian martyrs, like saying epithets against Islam so that they would get killed. It's the same kind of idea that is happening in Northern Europe. So the inquisitorial records attest to that, but also there are accounts, such as in the Chronicle of Solomon Bar Samson, where you have the idea that Christians are trying, or Jews rather, are trying to incite violence from Christians. So it's, if the Jews have tried to play nice and tried to quote unquote play nice, act as if they were going to convert to Christianity, kind of try to bide their time, then they might repent this and then say all of these curses against Mary and Jesus. So this happens not only in the Chronicle of Solomon Bar Samson, but also in that of Ephraim of Bon. In quite a bit of the Ashkenazic poetry, the Piyutim, you see lots of curses. And so there's some literature that is like specifically that says, so that we might perish and be closer to our Creator. There are various lines to that.
And how formulaic are these utterances? I mean, is there really a set prescribed thing that you say, or is it not?
So it is usually from the 12th century on, it's a combination that Mary is a whore and menstruant and that Jesus is a bastard. these three things seem to go together. That's not to say that you can't just say one with the hopes of inciting violence, but usually it's one or all three or two of three of these kind of statements. So the idea is to provoke Christians. Part of that has to do with different ideas of whether or not self-imposed martyrdom, suicide, is halakhically acceptable or not. So if they are not doing it themselves to become martyrs, you're still working towards that end to incite violence towards you, but you're still kind of in the legal realm. You're still okay. Thank you. Yeah, some of the literature by the Hasidei Ashkenaz also talks about this. So from Judah the Pious.
Any final questions? Thanks so much.
Thank you.